Hi, I'm Lucilla Runai and welcome to the Conservation Starter. Today I want to talk to you about conservation in social media, particularly about creating conservation content for social media, but also about consuming it. So let's jump right in. This is a summary of a webinar I did for the AICCM and also the Student Conservators at Melbourne, so shout out to them for their support. So the first thing you need to know about me is I love talking about conservation and sharing it, and that's why I started a YouTube channel. So what is social media? It's either a website or an application that allows its users to create and share content and to network with other users. I see social media as an incredibly powerful tool for conservation, and there's a lot of different ways you can use it. You can use it to engage with the conservation community and the general public, to advocate for and spread the word about conservation, to share ideas and innovations and get ideas and innovations yourself. And it also can be a wonderful way to network, create a public profile for yourself, and also a business tool. So I'm going to focus on what I know how to use, and I just want to say that I'm not an expert and there is so much out there and so many different ways to use it. So I really recommend trying things out. So what I really want to cover is tips and tricks on how to be a content creator and also a consumer, the channels that I think are really powerful to share conservation content, some of the accounts that I love to follow, and also maybe some ideas of what content we should and shouldn't show because of respect and permissions and copyright. I'm going to cover LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And I just want to acknowledge that there are so many more social media platforms out there, and there's more that keep being created. For example, TikTok is the new one, so I'm really curious to see how conservation is going to utilize that. Also, I do want to say that there is some incredible conservation content out there on blogs and Tumblr and also podcasts like the C Word podcast. So I want to start with if you are creating content. If you're going to have multiple accounts, multiple social media accounts, I really recommend having a consistent name or what they call a consistent handle across them. It just makes it easier for people to follow you across all the platforms. There are some conventions that the different social media channels allow. For example, Twitter won't allow dots, so it can be sometimes hard to have the exact same name for Twitter versus Instagram. Also, you can make a choice about whether you have your name, like me. I have all my social media accounts with my name in them. Feel free to follow me, except for YouTube, and that was a choice. Other people decide to have their business name as their handles, and other people decide to have something that has conservation specific in it, because it means they're easier to find. So you've got to decide what you would like to be known as, what your brand is, and then in the future, if you want to, most of the social media platforms do allow you to change. I really recommend personalizing your accounts as much as possible. If they have a profile image, if they have a banner image allowed, use them. If you're allowed to have an about section and include a link to somewhere else, use it. I think it's really important that your audience knows who you are and that you go that little extra effort to personalize your account and show who you are. Also, if you have multiple channels, I really recommend releasing the same content, catered to each platform a little differently, but ultimately it means you have the maximum output for the minimum effort. So that might be just repositioning a video. So instead of being a 16:9 ratio, which is best for Twitter, you change it to a 1:1 ratio, which is better for Instagram. So if you're going to be a content creator, I recommend while you're doing treatments, while you're working with objects, just create a lot of visual content. Sometimes it's important to just not have a plan with it. I have footage and photos that I took from being an intern years ago, and I'm now using it. So it's just a really great idea to create the content. Do it when you're in the moment. If you think you've got an incredible example of staining, if you've got a great example of foxing or discoloration because of exposure to light, just capture that. You might not know what you're going to use it for, but that's okay. As conservators, we work with incredibly beautiful things, so it's actually not that hard to make our visual content interesting and engaging, and most conservators have a really great eye to make sure, you know, things are centered or they have a great ratio within an image. So I say we use these skills as conservators to create our content. What we do is so interesting, so why not share it? In terms of creating content and planning it ahead of time, if you know that a treatment is going to dramatically change the look of an item, it is great to get before, during, and after treatment photos. And there's all number of ways you can compile them to share on social media. For example, an Instagram carousel where you can scroll through the images, or even just compile the images together into one so you can see a direct visual comparison. So if you know there's going to be a dramatic visual change, before, during, and after treatment photos are incredible. And usually we take those anyway, so we're just creating content that we need to create and using it in multiple ways. All my examples are paper, I'm realizing, but I am a paper conservator. If you're going to be doing a backing removal or a tape removal and you know that it's going to have a dramatic visual change and it's going to take some time, sometimes it can be really powerful to do a time lapse. So you can either create a time lapse at the time, or you can turn it into a video and then post-process it to speed it up and make it into a time lapse. After you create the content, if you haven't got it perfectly positioned or the perfect lighting, there is so many different things you can do post-creation to filter and edit it to get it to maybe a better production value, or if you're not satisfied with the lighting, you can change it. There is so many options to do that, both within the equipment that you capture the images on. For example, if you're doing it on your phone, there is so many filters on there, but also through the social media applications themselves. They'll allow you to apply filters, but also there's just complete editing software for photos and videos, and they let you do all number of things. So it's kind of limitless possibilities, and it's however technical you want to get. I really recommend looking at what other people in conservation on social media do and get inspiration from them. I saw a great example where someone was doing clicks, and each time she clicked, it changed image to a different stage of the treatment. Taking their idea, how they frame things, how they position things, the type of content they're creating, because there's some seriously talented people out there. And you can also go beyond conservation examples. You can look into bookbinding or design or art makers and just see what they do and how they create social media content. So the main thing is with the content you're creating is to keep it professional, because for a lot of us, conservation is our career and we are trying to have it in a professional format. So that means make sure you're being clear and concise, especially with written content. Make sure you edit what you're producing. A lot of social media platforms do allow you to go back and edit your posts. So Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, I believe they let you go back and edit if you've got spelling mistakes or you decide the wording's not quite right. However, Twitter doesn't allow you to do that. So if you make a spelling mistake, which I've been known to do when I whip out a tweet and send it off, you have to decide to either delete that tweet and you're losing all the engagement and all the exposure it's already had, or you leave it up there with the spelling mistake and just pretend it didn't happen. Edit. If you find it hard to edit your own words, there are applications out there that do it for you. I often try and write my copy in Word because it has a spell checker and a grammatical checker, and then you can pop it into the social media platform. Or have a friend that's good at checking your words and your work. So it's really important to consider your audience when you are creating conservation content. Is it the general public, or is it your conservation colleagues, or is it both? And often with social media platforms, you can't really control who the audience is. You can target it for a certain audience and make sure that that audience can find that content or are more likely to find that content, but ultimately you can't control who's going to see it. So you do need to be really careful on how you position the content and make sure it is suitable for both the general public and your conservation community, but you target and engage the audience you really want. If you are using a particular social media platform, I really recommend being familiar with the conventions of it. For example, Twitter allows 220 characters, whereas Instagram allows, I think, over 2,200. So it's really important that you know these conventions of each of the channels and you maximize how you use them. This includes hashtags, because a lot of social media channels allow them, and if you set up a bank of hashtags that you use in certain ways, it can really help you going forward creating content in the future. So I've talked a little bit about content creation. Now I want to talk about creating a following and building up your accounts. There is so much information out there by people that are experts in social media, and I really recommend doing a bit of research and seeing what techniques suit you. But ultimately, it takes time. It is a bit of trial and error and working out what works for you. I think the main thing if you're wanting to grow a following is to create quality content first of all. If you're starting out, it might not be the best, but you will get better, and you test and try and see what works for you, see what works for your audience. Being also consistent in the type of content you're creating, because if people have signed on to following you, they want to keep receiving that same kind of content. A lot of people might not know what conservation is and might not know to look for it, so they don't find it. So it's really important that you make yourself discoverable. You should, if you're wanting to be a content creator and grow a following, not just create content, but also engage with the existing creators. Comment, like, share, use the platform. Don't just throw your content out there and expect it to do well. There's also analytical tools you can use to allow you to see how your posts are doing, who you're reaching, and maybe help you set some goals. So in terms of Analytics, I am not an expert. There's a really easy way to check your analytics, for example, on Twitter. And I think you've got to pick and choose what data you pay attention to. For example, engagement rate on Twitter is probably more important than the impressions you get. So engagement rate is how many times people have actually engaged with your content rather than just scrolling past it. Whereas impressions means it's maybe appeared on their feed and they've scrolled past it. So that's good to know how many people are exposed to your content, but I think it's more important to know who's engaged with your content. In terms of consuming conservation in social media, I would say be really strategic and don't overwhelm yourself. There's so much quality content out there, but you do not have to consume it all, and you do not have to consume it all right now. You might go through a phase where you're like, yes, I want to read it all, but you don't have to. The conservation social media channels that you can follow, they can sometimes be individual conservators that are creating content. They can be conservation labs, whether private practice conservation labs or institution conservation labs. And sometimes conservation bodies have social media channels that you can follow, so national and international bodies. Sometimes there's also just galleries, libraries, archives, and museums that have a museum-wide account, but they will choose to feature conservation content there occasionally. And if they don't, they should. So there are so many great social media channels that focus on conservation content, and I'm going to cover some of them in later videos where I go a bit more focused onto the different types of social media channels. I really recommend going and looking at them and consuming that great content they're putting out there. You can learn so much. So I guess I would say be strategic about who you follow, be strategic about sort of the hashtags and things you search for and want to find. Regularly look at who you follow, review your timeline and your feed. Are you seeing what you want to see? Is this the content you want to see? If not, go back and unfollow people. You are not obliged to continually follow people. Also, you can really limit the notifications you get, including on your phone, but also email notifications. So you can turn off all those notifications and just go on that platform when you want. So now I just want to talk to you about when you're creating content, what should you share? What are we allowed to share? Ultimately, you are creating content and you might have a specific audience in mind, whether that's conservators or the general public, and you can target it to them, but ultimately you have no guarantee that that's the audience that's going to be consuming your content. So I think you do need to be really careful in terms of what you show, especially in treatment, for example. I do want to show how incredible the treatments that conservators do are, let people have a glimpse into the world of a conservator, but I do want to make sure it's really clear that it takes a lot of skill and training, and that I'm not encouraging people to try this at home. So I've tried a few different techniques to do that, including disclaimers, but I also make sure I don't do a step-by-step treatment process. Now I want to talk about sharing content in terms of, do you have permission to do it? Is it a copyright issue? Do you need to check that it's out of copyright and safe for you to share? Is it someone else's object? Do you need to ask permission before you share it? And also, does it maybe have sensitive material? Is it an indigenous item? So these are sort of the levels of checks you should go through, and there sometimes is aids for that. There's lots of great information about copyright out there. I'm really lucky at the Maritime Museum. In our collection management system, there is a way that you can check the copyright and what's out of copyright. So I instantly know from a copyright perspective it's okay for me to share. But those are just some extra considerations you should have when creating content, maybe why you shouldn't share things. So I strongly recommend finding some way to contribute to your workplace. If you don't work in an institution and instead you're working at a private practice and they don't have a social media channel, maybe see if you can encourage them to create one. Or if they already do have one, try and generate content for them, help them with their work, because it's so important to spread the word about conservation. I mentioned earlier that a lot of museums only have a museum-wide channel, which includes a lot of information and content that they share, and that they sometimes share conservation content on there, or if they don't, they should. So this is where I'm going to say, if you do work in an institution and they don't have a conservation social media channel, which is completely understandable, nowhere where I've worked so far has had one, it's maybe a really good idea to work really closely with them and see if you can supply conservation content. So if you're already taking before and during and after treatment photos, if you can take behind the scenes of installs and supply that content to them for them to share, or you let them know when there's a critical moment or something that they might want to capture and get them to come into the lab and work with you to create the content. I think that's really important. It means that conservation content's being shared to a general heritage audience, and it means your colleagues might get to know a bit more about what you do. Also, if you do work at an institution or a private practice, sometimes there is an expert in social media right there, and I cannot recommend enough, learning from other people that do know what they're doing in social media. In terms of costs, most social media channels are free, which is pretty fantastic. They also do offer a paid option for some things like LinkedIn. I don't see the need for that, so I pay $0 for my social media. Downside to that is that means they're going to be having ads. That's how they make their money. So in terms of equipment that I use, I generally use quite cheap and cheerful stuff. For example, my phone, and my photos have gotten better as I've upgraded my phones. I started out with a pretty crappy phone, which was secondhand and pretty broken. I also use a stand sometimes to put my phone on when I'm creating videos or time lapses, and that's quite useful. Also, sometimes when I'm creating images, I also use this. It is a little loop that you can clip onto your phone, and it has magnification, and it creates really interesting magnified images. So you can get these very cheaply from anywhere. There's so many different types. Some of them have a bit better capabilities, so I recommend doing some research, but it creates some really engaging magnified images. So yeah, you don't need to use very expensive equipment to create great content. You can go way more high tech. A lot of conservation labs have really powerful cameras already there, so you can use those to capture your content. We usually have portable lights as well. Why not use those if you want to? So I just use what I have access to, and I think that's really important. So there is so much out there, so much conservation in social media content, and there's a high chance you're going to get overloaded. I know that I do sometimes, and we do not need to be overloaded right now. We've got enough going on. So my main advice would be to be really strategic. So that includes maybe defining your social media accounts, whether they're personal or professional or anywhere in between. You can be a creator and a consumer. You can have multiple accounts. So again, the overloading is a high potential. So I guess the main thing is to regularly take stock and see, is it working for you? Try something different, try something new, maybe get rid of something that's not working, but just, yeah, regularly take stock, be strategic, and look after yourself. Is there any social media channels that you haven't tried yet? If there is, maybe go and have a go and see if you like them or not. If you have social media channels, but so far you've only ever consumed content, maybe instead start trying to create content and see if you enjoy doing that. If you already have social media channels where you create content, maybe try consuming instead, or try and like upskill your creation of content. I just really want to encourage you to try something, go through a bit of trial and error, see what works for you, and just give it a go and don't overload yourself. So I hope you enjoyed learning about conservation in social media, how to consume and create content. There are going to be more videos where I go very specifically on tips and tricks for each social media channel, so stay tuned for those videos coming up. And I will see you all soon. Well, not really. Anyway, I hope you learnt lots. See you next time.